not the way to get respect of your peers. I've heard about graduate students, for example, in science who want to become involved more in public engagement activities, not particularly political ones, not particularly engagé, but just engaged. I've actually heard about actually tried to hide this from their advisors because their advisors still want them to spend all their time in the laboratory or the field or whatever their field is. So you've identified one barrier to becoming more outspoken, but there's actually a bunch of them. People are worried about, what will my peers think if I take a political position, because we're supposed to be neutral and objective, and that's part of the ethos of science. So it's a very, very complicated constellation of pressures.
If I can just follow on, in Australia, not most of the scientists are employed by industry, and they're not all universities, and even in the universities, tenure is very hard to get. So in fact, continuing employment is an issue for the scientists there, and that's perhaps why our experts, the people who speak out, are those who are very old and very wise and no longer under threat. So our Nobel Prize winners speak on a range of different issues and purposely use that prize as a platform for them to have a voice, and a powerful, effective voice in our country. But often it's only those who are not threatened who, and are more confident perhaps, but certainly not threatened, who are the ones who are the public experts on a range of different issues.
Yes, but I think Chiara's comments had also another idea, which is whether a hugely visible scientific celebrity as Cox is actually helping the field in a general sense. Now, this would be a very interesting research question. I'm not really sure we could see that effect. Of course, we have examples of, but in that case, was a scientist, but she was mostly a science writer. We have the striking case of Rachel Carson and her book actually putting on the agenda, particularly in the United States, certain environmental issues and related to. But of course, it's. I mean, it would be interesting to investigate whether the effect is just personal, whether the effect is making science pop and fun, or actually, as your colleagues think or hope, having a Brian Cox of chemistry will actually change things for chemistry itself. You mentioned Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Is it on in the same thread? I know there are many threads going.
It's more of the Australian thread.
Okay, try it. Okay, try it.
Hi, I'm sorry if I missed the earlier part of the conversation. We in Canada have had a problem in the last 7 years with the government actually muzzling, as we like to say, federal scientists from speaking to journalists and therefore to the public. And this has been an issue that scientists by surprise. They never thought they would see that happen to them. The older scientists, as you mentioned, the ones who've been the eminence grise, the ones who've been around for a while, can speak out, and they do. David Schindler, actually, who is known for making sure that we got phosphates out of water in the environmental lakes area, all kinds of very interesting scientists. He actually compared the current government. He said, I started my career under McCarthyism, and I'm ending it under something quite similar, which was a pretty outrageous thing to say, but he said it. And I'm doing a talk tomorrow about evidence for democracy, which is a different kind of movement because it's the young scientists acting up. They really all of a sudden saw that the pressure was getting so great that if they didn't step into the arena, it wasn't going to work. The media, and that's where I come from, we did our part. Older scientists did their part. The public service of Canada tried to do their part. They surveyed the federal scientists to see whether or not they were feeling muzzled or feeling the pinch. But until the scientists stepped into the arena, they didn't get the public attention the same way, because I think the public assumes that journalists are going to be griping about something. Public servants always want more money or something. So I think this was a really interesting experiment. It's the first time we've seen scientists move that way politically. And so Evidence for Democracy was their movement which wanted to see access to scientists, unlimited access to scientists who had something to say about particular areas, Environment Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, particularly affected by these kind of clamp down on who could talk to whom. And they also were pushing for the use of evidence in public policy formation. So interesting, it's ongoing.
Just allow me to remind you that at the very beginning, Massimiliano said we need to revisit this concept of visible scientists, particularly in the digital media context. And I did a little bit in that I wrote a chapter for a book about science, actually scientist blogging rather than science blogging. I make that distinction. And something I became more aware of just looking at who does and who doesn't, and bearing in mind all the constraints that Susanna has referred to and Suzette has referred to and Catherine has referred to that hold people back from engaging in public media of any kind, I think there's a factor there that's quite hard to name and almost impossible to research, and that is a capacity for self-promotion. You actually need to be a blogger and to tell us what you had for breakfast. You need actually to believe that it's interesting to other people what you do, what you think, what you scratch, what you dream of, and so on. And for and insofar as we have a personality profile of the typical scientist, they are acculturated not to be like that. Let me put it like that. You know, and to write in the passive voice. Now that's changing as it happens in scientific journals, but I think there is a sort of, I don't know how to call it, a sort of social psychological factor there that, as I say, is quite difficult to name, and I wouldn't want to either regard it as shaming by naming, but I think it's there. Some of the latecomers probably don't know what we're doing here, and it might be difficult to follow. We have taken some of the words that are on the screen. They have been selected in various proportions by members of the audience, and we're working our way around them, through them, and finding all sorts of connections between them and ambiguities within them. We keep going.
Yes. You just mentioned the self-promotion of scientists. I think it's part of the expertise of scientists and science communication professionals as well. Susanna, you refer to the expertise. In our university there is a program on professionalization of science communication professionals, and we try to figure out what the professional profiles of science communication practitioners could be, and there is a lot of literature in communication sciences about professional profiles, so that's a nice thing. And usually not only knowledge but also experience, intuition, skills, and the personality of persons are all relevant for their expertise. So of course, I think we'll have to see them in context, and especially the focus on concepts, as you mentioned, is a very important one. In showing your expertise, you will have to make explicit what your idea of a specific context is, in a concept is, in my opinion.
Well, I noticed that science is not one of the key terms of the dictionary, right? And I was just wondering how the visions of academic and post-academic science can challenge some of the keywords of the dictionary.
Okay. Yeah, I can say something on that, but maybe we take another question. Can we get the microphone to that gentleman? Yeah?
Well, I was just wondering why the concept like, well, as soon as science enters media, it becomes an object of consumption. And how come words like the epistemic consumption and marketing aren't involved in these keywords? It's a product. So why don't we use concepts like marketing and consumption when we consider aspects of science communication?
Sorry, just in answer to the last two, all of us, and we certainly are involved in explorations of new and productive models for examining these things. What we were doing here was picking up on the commonly used vocabulary, okay? This, if you like, the established vocabulary, and we reckoned that you could kind of map your way through 25 years of scholarship and reflection in this area in and around these particular keywords. That was the choice. Okay, it wasn't done on the basis of a kind of a citation, or a bibliometric thing, or whatever, or a frequency. Sorry, a frequency analysis. But of course, there are other things going on behind, as academic and post-academic, or normal and post-normal, or whatever, that are all very useful tools for understanding some of these things. Do you have a particular interest in the concept of social marketing by any chance, which is something I've only heard reasonably recently as having a potential application in this area? Are you aware of? You know about social marketing? Not a lot. Not a lot. But
no, I don't know a lot about social marketing, but I'd like to comment on that because I wrote the chapter on public relations in science for the handbook. And interestingly enough, we started out our chapter with a kind of excuse of having to excuse that we include public relations in science, and really, and we start off with trying to legitimize why is it important to think in that way. And I think that there is a shyness or an uncomfortable feeling about these natures, and I think it's hard to explain, but it probably has to do with the fact that the most science communicators are closely related to the scientific culture and the scientific community, so they identify much more with the scientific world than with people engaged in the business world or in marketing, and I think that's probably part of the reason. So it's a cultural phenomenon in a sense, but because I don't see any epistemic reasons why we shouldn't embrace those kinds of ideas and do much more. It would be interesting to see this handbook in its 10th edition. Probably social marketing will have its own entry.
I hope to be dead by then.
As usual in these situations, there's a whole stack of things building up. So, but probably most people in the room are familiar with Dorothy Nelken's book, Selling Science, in which she argued that most of our journalism was an attempt to sell science to the public. But this was also a critical book. She was not necessarily celebrating that approach, but rather saying, wait, stop and think what you're doing. You may think of yourself as informing the public, but there are actually power issues involved. So this issue of marketing inevitably brings up power issues. Social marketing is a word that we can all be confused about because it is used in many different ways. But the way I've most commonly seen it used, we do a lot of this in science communication, for better or for worse. Mostly for better, but it's simply connecting what we're selling to people's social values. And so I don't like the word framing. I'm glad it isn't on here because, whoa, but it means nothing now. I'm sorry. It's used in so many different ways. But people who talk about framing science, in part, are talking about, well, let's package science in a way that people package it for marketing purposes, in a way that people see the relationship to their own lives. So that's my understanding of social marketing. We actually do it all the time. It isn't all bad. We want people to understand how science is important to them and is important to their lives and could be useful for their lives. That's really why we're here. But we just don't want to do it in a manipulative way. And so marketing, social marketing, framing, all those things suggest that we're trying to fool people about how valuable science is, and I hope we're not trying to do that. So, yeah.
Just a minute. Of course, as we said in the beginning, this is an open list, so we welcome any addition, but I see your point, for example, potentially part of science culture today. Science as an object of consumption, science as part of popular culture. I mean, if Andy Warhol was still alive, he would probably paint Brian Cox, Dolly the sheep in multiple colors. The Higgs boson, maybe it's not so easy, but the Higgs boson, I mean, isn't it a case of research at the edge, but at the same time huge marketing in the neutral sense of the word? And Brian was mentioning digital media. Digital media are very good for scientific institutions to bypass traditional mediators and go directly to the public to present their ideas. If you look at CERN website today, it's impressive. It's not a website, only the website of a research institution. It's offering videos, interview, everything for the final consumer of science, so to say.
I think it's very important that we do actually recognize the reality that we operate in markets at the same time as we operate in communities and operate in cultures. I'm not quite sure that you can use the word marketing in a neutral sense. I'm not sure that that's that's philosophically possible. But remember that moment when Rolf Dieter Hoyer, the director of CERN, had the assembled scientists in the room, including Peter Higgs, in July of 2012, and said, as the evidence of traces of a Higgs boson-like particle were presented, he stands up and he says, "I think we've got it. I think we've got it, haven't we?" And they rise to their feet, applauding this achievement. And this is live streamed. Now, I'm sorry, even in his innocence, he must have known that that is selling something. That is selling something. And indeed, I remember in that discussion at CERN that I referred to earlier on, in 2001, having this discussion with CERN scientists saying, what happens, and I said, what happens if you don't find the Higgs boson? This is 2001, remember? And they said, but we will. And I said, no, but what happens if you don't? But we will. No, imagine that you cannot actually prove the existence of the Higgs boson. We'll just keep going. And standing up and shouting, saying we have it, is all about we have to keep going. And he's promoting his institution to the funders. That's selling. I don't think that can be called neutral.
I think actually you have both asked and answered the question that I was going to bring up. I'd like to unpack the whole idea of science culture more, because I think, as you've just been saying, there are many cultures. And when we were discussing science culture before, it came to me that are we talking about the culture of science, or is it the culture of the way different peoples, different publics view science? And I suspect there's a whole lot to unbundle in there, and I'd really like your comments on the difference between science seen in Africa, for example, and science seen in Asia or America. I think that just like we now talk about many publics, that there are actually many cultures. But if we talk about science itself, or if you like, evidence or knowledge as a culture, is that what you're talking about? I'm confused in my head here, and I'd really like you to discuss it more.
It's not entirely answering your question, but this Higgs boson conversation just reminded me of the fact that I'd like to know how many people who know about the Higgs boson from listening to all the scientific communication about it, and how many people know about the Higgs bosons because they bought Nick Cave's latest album with the song Higgs Boson Blues on it. So that's different cultural perspectives, but not regional ones, I know.
That's science in popular culture, isn't it? I think we still have time for another question. Yes? Niels?
The only one who picked participation.
Go ahead.
So, a minority choice here of participation. I actually wanted to, ask the the speakers to discuss limits of participation and maybe also the appropriateness or agreeability of non-participation. And I guess it relates quite a bit to what Susanna was talking about in her opening talk or address about the classification of expertise and the operationalization of expertise, and you were talking about memberships. I have a lot of passive memberships in Amnesty International, environmental organizations, and so on. I don't play an active role. I'm not an activist. I still enjoy the membership, and in many ways, I imagine that most of what you also call ordinary citizens enjoy membership in knowledge society in a more broad sense, whereas an active participation, being part of the expert, subgroups or sub-communities might infer ideas about credentials, about qualifications, certifications, which is something very different from membership. And also, to a certain degree, it would be perhaps acceptable that many of us take a passive role, but still have ideas about, being member of a knowledge society more generally. So I guess that in many ways, the reason that I wanted you to discuss participation also relates to a dominant Republican idea about active membership, about the duties that are implied in membership, whereas it might be appropriate to many people to have a more liberal understanding of what it means to be a member that is enjoying certain rights and privileges, the access to information, whereas the active part of it is perhaps of a lower importance. So how should we think about elements of participation, or these dimensions of participation today?
Sorry, shall we get the last one also, and then you?
Okay. Yeah.
Well, going back to the market, the social market issue, and maybe being a bit provocative, and as a father of two adolescents, and I always been fighting against the consumer society, this sort of paradigm that we live today. But I mean, isn't that important that you get these kind of issues into in order to promote the science culture? Because we are in a consumer society, let's say, and why couldn't we tackle this sort of science culture from this perspective? Why not try to promote? I know this is quite controversial, but I mean, I think just a question to be raised.
We started a book here. I think we started several. I don't know if that was the intention, but these are such big issues. It's hard to know how to respond in a few minutes. But I think science culture, which relates to your comment and then back to participation, I think that one of the things that we might hope to gain by a variety of participation programs is that people are familiar with science in the sense that they're comfortable with it. That doesn't mean to say that they need to buy all of it, but that they are thoughtful about it. They aren't put off from thinking about it because they don't feel they have the right credentials. Rather, they have a certain ownership. Scientists, this is part of the ethical obligation of scientists to engage with the public, is in fact we mostly pay for science through taxes or indirectly, and I think that creates a very literal obligation as well as it's strategic. That's a whole other area. Can we be strategic and democratic at the same time? I don't know, but we want people to feel a sense of ownership about science, and that's what I mean by science culture, as opposed to scientific culture or the culture of science, which is more the sociology of science itself internally, how it's organized. So not entirely wrong to sell science. We just have to be reflective about it. On participation, I don't know if I've ever put this in print, but I've been known to admit that I don't very often go to science engagement activities, and even though I'm a great champion of them, but there's only 24 hours in the day. And as a single parent raising 2 sons trying to get tenure in a very tough academic world, I don't have time to go to a science cafe. I only went to one of those fairly recently for the first or second time. And yet, like your partial vicarious membership in Amnesty International, I really am a champion of what they do, sincerely. We all budget our time in the modern world. We cannot participate in everything, and we cannot expect a variety of audiences, publics, subcultures within our complex cultures. We can't expect everybody to even care about science, or they may care, but they're not going to come to our events. They're not going to participate in that kind of active, engaged sense that is our ideal model sometimes. So that's why I say there's still a role for media. There's still a role for passive participation. If you have a science engagement event and you write a web page about it, which, by the way, is a form of journalism, okay? It's not, journalism is not dying, it just comes in a new form. So you write a web page about it, you write a newspaper article about it, that allows what in extension work they used to call a multiplier effect. So only 20 people can come to the event, but 200 or 2,000 or potentially 2 million people might be saying, yes, I'm glad this event happened, this discussion is interesting, this has made me think about my position on stem cell research or what I should do about climate change. And to think of a whole continuum between unengaged and don't care, and there's lots of stuff that's important in the world that I'm not engaged in. There's only so much time. We can't expect everybody to take on our issues and our subjects as the center of their lives. So there'll be some people who are not going to be engaged, but there'll be other people who engage in important ways, but vicariously through media accounts or other secondary forms of communication. So it's hard.
One last comment, Christian and Ryan.
You have a comment in the back.
Oh.
So briefly about participation. So I'll say that in a world that we live in, I would say that non-participation is an impossibility. So whether you like it or not, you participate in techno-scientific culture. You know, being born, you come out. It's a technical achievement, so to speak, and you are born as a participant in this culture. So I would rather think in terms of degrees of participation. But I would also say that from an academic perspective, these concepts appear vague and very difficult to pin down, and that's the problem for many of us. But I would say from the practitioner's point of view, and again I return to something I mentioned in the beginning, from the practitioner's point of view, it's not about vagueness, it's about mobilization. So these concepts are very good for mobilizing people in different spheres and different practices of science communication, and I think that's another part that we need to take into account, the degree to which these concepts are able to mobilize and gather people around different science communication practices, and that's the non-academic perspective on some of these concepts.
Susanna, thanks for the last comment. I thought that was very interesting indeed. The thing that I'm thinking about here is we should ask ourselves, how are we democratic, and how do we participate, and how do we operationalize these terms? I mean, there's nowhere where we go out and have a referendum about, except Switzerland maybe, where we have a referendum about science issues. I mean, where does that happen? The only way we can be democratic nowadays is when we passed by the checkout counter in the supermarket, or that's when we vote about what's going on scientifically. I mean, if I want to buy GMO crops, for instance, that's where I place my vote. If I want to do something about climate change, I'd take my bike to work instead of driving the car, and then I'm voting at the petrol station. So we need to operationalize how these concepts of democracy and participation, how do we actually participate in society nowadays? And the fact is that we participate as consumers. It's simply a cold, hard fact as far as I see, and I think science communication ought to consider this when we're operationalizing these terms like engagement and participation in publics. What does that mean in a modern neoliberal society? So that's not so much a question as it's a response, but I don't know if you could respond to that. How do you operationalize these questions?
Well, I think you're now starting another conversation altogether. I think we're really careful about saying the fact is, because there are lots of other potential facts to be observed, that we can be both citizens and consumers simultaneously, and they are not necessarily incompatible, but they're not necessarily the same thing either. But yeah, and actually just reverting to the institutions that many of us work in, the higher education institutions, a lot of my colleagues say students are being treated as mere consumers in a kind of marketization and corporatization of universities. Yeah, and I think mere consumers, maybe the rights of consumers are a bit higher than those of the apprentice in the medieval form of the university, where you do what you're told to do, and you get the grades given to you as a matter of honor or whatever, graciously given by the professor. So maybe being a consumer can also be, I hesitate to say empowering, but it gives you entitlements. And in relation to, I think, very interesting, I mean, I think Niels raised participation and I thought talked about it very interestingly, and I think that we ought to be very careful in our field not to always engage in a kind of normative discussion and a normative analysis, which is that people ought to participate or should participate, or that scientists, we have spent so many years talking about what scientists should do, so rather than trying to understand why it is they do what they do or why they choose not to participate. I defend the right not to participate.
You wanted to say very briefly something?
Just really quickly. I think that market choices are a form of participation, but they're just not the only form. Very interestingly, with GMOs, we now have a very active movement in a number of states in the United States for GMO labeling. Surprise, surprise, that sentiment was there all along, but somehow it didn't come out until this generation, which has embraced it. But that's just a side comment. I do agree that market choices are a form of participation, but I think they're a fairly weak form of participation. And historically, marketing has been, in fact, when you sell stuff, it's not neutral. So even market choices can be made more reflectively. If we choose to ride our bike because we're taking a position on climate change, that's different if somebody sells us a bicycle because it's just cool and jazzy and has cool stripes on it and it's fun and hip. So the matters of interpretation there. I do agree with your point. I promised 10 seconds. Okay, 15. I do agree that there's a big problem with participation. Participation exercises have taken place all over the world, including big countries, complex countries like Brazil and the United States and so on. But it doesn't scale up very well, and there's no mechanism for taking the outcome of public discussions and inserting them into the political process, unless it's going to change somebody's vote. Most politicians in a democracy don't care. So I agree that there's problems there, but I don't agree entirely that marketing is a very strong form of participation, or consuming, rather.
I think we didn't address your comment about post-academic science. I mean, as a sociologist, I of course I would have much liked to see that keyword, but it's not part of the common jargon of public communication of science or science communication. Sometimes actually I have the impression we're talking about science communication today in a very decontextualized, in a very abstract way, without taking into account all of the changes in science, in society, and in their interaction. But of course you can take post-academic science and the transformation of science organization in some of these keywords, like expertise, for example, has substantially changed if you think about interaction with the industry, for example, or with non-governmental organizations. So I think we should conclude here. Thanks for participating in this little experiment of keywords, and we hope you enjoyed it. We certainly did. Thanks, Susanna. Thanks, Christian, Brian. Thanks, all of you. Bye-bye.